By every measure, the big banks are bigger. The term sheet, Fortune's Deals blog term sheet. The Buzz term sheet. Fear and Greed. Dow 30. ETFs. Mutual funds. Video. Term sheet. The latest on private equity, M&A, deals and movements, from Wall Street to Silicon Valley. Comments. By every measure, the big banks are bigger by Stephen Gandel, Senior Editor, September 13, 2013, 11:42 a.m. Assets at the six largest U.S. banks are up 37% from 5 years ago. What happened? Fortune, 1/3 of all business loans this year were made by Bank of America. Wells Fargo funds nearly a quarter of all mortgage loans, and held in the vaults of J.P. Morgan Chase is $1.3 trillion, which is 12% of our collective cash, including the payrolls of many thousands of companies, or enough to buy 47,636,496,885 of these NFL-branded toaster ovens. Thanks for your business. A lot has changed since the financial crisis. The number of large banks and Wall Street firms have disappeared. There are new regulations in the works meant to limit risky trading and bring derivatives that compounded the financial system's losses into regulated markets. Subprime lending has been coming back recently, but it's still a fraction of what it once was. But at least one of the widely recognized causes of the financial crisis is not only still around, it has perhaps gotten worse. By every measure I can't think of, and I have tried a bunch, the big banks are bigger than they were 5 years ago, at the dawn of the financial crisis. More, remembering the families at the center of the financial crisis. We still have many of the excesses we saw leading up to 2008, says Robert Reich, the Berkeley economics professor and a former labor secretary. The banks are still too big to fail, too big to jail, and too big to manage well. The six largest banks in the nation now have 67% of all the assets in the U.S. financial system, according to bank research firm S&L Financial. That amounts to $9.6 trillion, up 37% from 5 years ago. And the big banks seem to be getting better at acquiring assets all the time. The overall growth of assets in the system in the same time is up just 8%. The biggest bank in the nation, J.P. Morgan JPM, has $2.4 trillion in assets alone, the size of England's economy. And J.P. Morgan is 7 times larger than the nation's number 10 bank U.S. Bancorp USB, which itself has $350 billion in assets, along the lines of Austria, and at this point is probably part of the TBDF club as well. Also way up, profits. The 4 biggest banks in the U.S. alone, which along with J.P. Morgan include Bank of America-backed Citigroup C and Wells Fargo WFC, made collectively nearly $45 billion in the first 6 months of the year, 9 times what those same banks made 5 years ago. Assets have grown more than many other size metrics. But across the board, nearly every measure of the big bank's size is up. In terms of loans, according to FDIC data, 42% of all loans outstanding by U.S. banks come from the 5 largest. That's up from 38% before the financial crisis. The 4 biggest banks in the nation employ just over 1 million people. That's up from around 900,000 just before the financial crisis. And those big banks have less competition. Just over 1,400 banks have disappeared in the past 5 years. About 485 failed. The rest were merged into other banks. More, the rich got richer since the financial crisis. Earlier this week, the government released a presentation about what regulators have accomplished since the financial crisis. On one slide there is a big red check next to "and too big to fail." In fact, regulators have had little success forcing the big banks to shrink. Provisions of the Dodd-Frank law impose new costs, particularly on the largest financial firms. The idea was that the executives of the big banks would take a look at all the new rules and decide on their own, or under pressure from investors, that it was better to be smaller. But so far that doesn't seem to be the conclusion Wall Street came to. Shares of the biggest banks have rebounded sharply in the past 2 years. And Dodd-Frank never created a permanent bailout fund that could be used to pay for the job of cleaning up a big bank failure. Instead, the law relies on the FDIC to do the job. But the FDIC's resolution fund has just $37.9 billion in it, which is less than 1/2 of 1% of the assets in the big banks. It's hard to see our way around another